Oh, hi, Doctor Who, yes, what happened? Hello, interwebs, I hope you're all doing well, and a happy belated Easter, or Passover, or Ramadan for all of those who celebrate it, or, you know, happy just living if you're like me and don't celebrate any of those things. But regardless if you celebrate anything or not, we did get a little extra special treat this weekend with a brand new Doctor Who special, Legend of the Sea Devils, the penultimate episode of Jodie Whitaker's run as the Doctor. Also, just a brief note here that it would be remiss of me not to mention the currently ongoing issues and controversy with the BBC regarding its publishing of a deeply transphobic article that spread misinformation about the trans community, which was clearly disproven and didn't meet the BBC's own standards of journalistic rigor, and which, in its initial form, cited a woman who called for the lynching of trans people, which it has yet to retract despite multiple requests and protests. Below in the description you'll find a link to the video by the YouTuber Sean that goes into more specifics about the article, as well as a link to one of my own videos that goes further into the context surrounding the harmful gender-critical movement that the article was part of. While the creators of Doctor Who are in no way a part of this, I would personally feel uncomfortable discussing a BBC-owned series without at least mentioning this issue. I actually was really anticipating this story. Not only was it a swashbuckling adventure, if I could say words correctly, and I generally like those. Those are some of my favorite kind of stories, like Count of Monte Cristo, Pirates of the Caribbean, Master and Commander, one of my favorite movies of all time, which is actually a secret Star Trek movie, by the way. Fight me on that, but I consider Master and Commander basically just a Star Trek movie on the high seas. Regardless, though, I generally enjoy these types of movies. And secondly, I was also kind of hoping that since this was the penultimate episode, that they would put a lot of energy and time and effort into it, while also still allowing it to be a fun story on its own, because it didn't have to bear the burden of the New Year special or the regeneration story, that it could just be a big blockbuster thing that just still felt like one final fun outing for Jodie. However, unfortunately, though, I feel like this episode falls into the same exact trap that a previous sort of middle of a group of specials episode did, and that was Planet of the Dead, the one of the penultimate David Tennant specials before his ultimate regeneration. Does anyone remember Planet of the Dead? Because I barely remember it, and that is ultimately my problem here with Legend of the Sea Devils. This episode just kind of feels forgettable and bland. I ultimately kind of just felt bored watching the whole thing, and say what you will about Chris Chibnall's era of Doctor Who, which I have not been a particular fan of, as I think most Doctor Who fans generally have not been a particular fan of his work. I've always been at least engaged with his work in the way that's more I see all the pieces that you're doing here, and I wish you didn't fit them together this way. And here, I don't have that feeling. I'm not frustrated or angry or upset or bothered or even excited by anything. I'm just sort of there yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, that's fine. That's basically the vibe that I get from this entire episode, and it's very weird because it just has this monotonous sort of tone to it, and maybe that comes from it filming during the pandemic. You could kind of tell that was the case, considering so many of the sets, they come up with reasons for it within the story, but a lot of the sets are just empty, and so the energy just feels really low, and I feel like that might be intentional, building up to the regeneration story and the sort of note that we end the episode on, which I do think was the strong point of the episode, the sort of more melancholic feel to the final minute or so of the episode. But I wish there had been more to carry me through, more energy to carry me throughout this, or even a more heavier tone overall, because that would have at least given it a little bit more character flavor. But otherwise, it just feels meh, we're just here going along in our feeling with it. Let me talk a little bit about specifics, and I can get into some positives here. First off, the opening of this episode did have a little bit of that energy to it. I liked the Sea Devils look, and they certainly gave off this menacing feel right off the bat with him just sort of killing this village. And I don't have a lot of history or knowledge of classic era Who. I do know the Sea Devils were a thing that existed, and they were sort of a species that existed on Earth, similar to Madame Vastra's species that we saw back in Matt Smith's era. And so I do know a little bit of their history. Ultimately, I don't have a lot of awareness of the Sea Devils. So getting to see this introduction to them, I thought was a great and grand sort of intro to them. And I liked that the Doctor was clearly surprised that they had something like a ship, and we get this sort of like Flying Dutchman image and things like that. That was very menacing and sort of just had this presence to them. And I thought that sold them really, really, really well. However, the opening did feel, in a weird way, like clipped and rushed, which is strange because a lot of the time I felt that Chibnall era Who has felt a little bit overlong, but here, this one felt like there was just bits missing. Like there was no build up to, for example, the characters going to grab the Sea Devil in the net. It just sort of happened and I was like, oh, didn't realize that was the plan. Or later on, once the Sea Devil got onto his ship, we had like Dan going off with Madam Chin, who I was just sort of like, oh, I didn't realize she had gotten on her ship without the Doctor being there. And then we just sort of cut to the Doctor and Yaz going off to do their thing without really being, like there were just moments that felt missing from the intro, which was very odd to both like skip over beats and yet also elongate them, because then we needed to have Dan and this dude who's with him, who ultimately is also forgettable, sneak onto Madam Chin's ship. Let's talk about the dude. I don't even remember his name because of how ultimately forgettable it was. He had this chip on his shoulder for his father dying. I mean, quite obviously because Madam Chin released the Sea Devil. And I thought like, okay, that's an interesting sort of thing. But ultimately, once he gets on her ship and he has like, I'm gonna kill her. And then he hears her backstory for a little bit. He's like, oh, I guess it's fine. And then he ultimately just becomes an entirely forgettable character. And so I'm like, oh, his one arc that he had, he just sort of like gives up on 10 minutes into his story. I was like, okay, so then why even give that to him, and why is he even here ultimately? Also, too, Madam Chin was sort of the big selling point of the episode. Like, that was the big, like, oh, this is the historical figure that we're going to focus on. And it goes with a lot of Chibnall era's intention, which focusing on very big historical figures throughout history and teaching us about them, especially forgotten women characters throughout history, which is something I've, it has not always done well in Chris Chibnall's era, but it's something I've appreciated him doing. And she is a fantastic character to focus on from history. If you learn anything about her, like, go look her up in a history book. One of the most badass figures that ultimately gets forgotten, at least in Western history, because we are very like Western culture focused and very white focused. And so when we think of pirates, you don't necessarily think of Chinese figures, but she was one of the most badass, if not the most badass pirate out there. But ultimately though, she's also forgettable here. She has this thing about like, I'm doing this for my crew, but she doesn't really get a lot of focus, and I don't have a ton of feeling for her. I don't really get a sense of like what she feels for her crew. Is there anyone specific that she had? There was just nothing tangible to really hook me into her story. However, there were a few brief moments throughout the story that I did find to have a little bit of life and spark to them. I did appreciate the idea of the Doctor and Yaz going back in time to sort of learn more about the disappearance of Ji-hyun's ship as they're looking for the disappearing treasure of the Flor de la Mar. I thought that was rather clever, but I thought the best moment of the episode was when they come to the present day again, or at least the present day of the storyline, and they're at the bottom of the ocean. That was a really, really wonderful image, and I think something cool and unique that I've never really seen done a ton, at least not in Doctor Who, and very rarely in other things, like getting to see the bottom floor of the ocean and having that be a romantic beat between Yaz and the Doctor, even if it's not like a overly stated one. I thought, in fact, I appreciated that it was a very understated moment of romanticism between the two. I thought that was one of the strongest beats. But then there was a very strange moment directly after that, where the Doctor's like looking at the ocean floor and she says, Yaz, the ocean floor is disappearing. And Yaz doesn't seem to have any realization, despite the fact that like what we're seeing is the floor literally dropping out beneath them. I'm like, why was Yaz not noticing that? And it felt like a weird disconnect between what the actor was told to react to and then ultimately what the VFX artist came up with in post-production, because obviously the actor doesn't know what they're going to be seeing. But it feels like the directors told her to like, oh, you're not seeing it, you're not reacting to it because you're not aware of the floor disappearing. But when the way that it's visualized on screen, I feel like Yaz would have seen it. So it's just this weird disconnect between the actor sort of reacting to something and the visualization of it. It felt kind of disappointing and very weird in that moment. But ultimately, though, this does bring us back to the Sea Devil of it all, because it gets to this convoluted narrative of the Sea Devils have a ship because it's intimidating to the land people, which, okay, I guess is just a justification for them to have a cool ship generally. And ultimately, his plan was to find this keystone MacGuffin thing that Madam Chin had brought to the island to free the Sea Devil. and get it in order to terraform essentially all of Earth into a giant water planet, sort of making his own water world, as it were. Or like that one episode where Tom Paris got reduced back to the rank of ensign back in Star Trek Voyager, that sort of planet. Which is a fine idea for a villain role. It's one of those like, "Waha, I shall destroy the world" thing. And ultimately the Sea Devil, while interesting at first and had a certain weight and menace to him at first, he just becomes a maniacal whatever dude that, again, is rather bland. And ultimately, when he gets killed, when Ji-hoon is released and they stop him, I honestly was like, oh, I guess he's dead now. Okay. Cool. I felt nothing. It just felt like an afterthought that he was dead. And there's the moment where the doctor's like, "Oh, you killed him." One of those like ultimate doctor moments where she's just like, "Oh, you killed him." And then we forget about it later on because she's just supposed to be upset that he killed somebody, but we're not going to actually wanting to deal with that in any way, shape, or form. We just wanted the character off the board. So we'll have him kill him, and then the doctor will get upset and we'll move on. And then they MacGuffin science tech stuff, and they save the day. So yeah, again, rather bland. However, again, to give a couple positives to the episode, I did really like the Yaz and Doctor stuff. I have to admit, I have not that I'm against Yaz and the Doctor being together, and I know a lot of shippers out there are there for it. It's not been my strongest ship in any of like Doctor Who-dom, but I've appreciated that they've at least leaned into it, but it hasn't really entirely felt entirely natural, I guess, to me over the past few episodes. But in this episode, for the first time, I at least got a sense of weight and feel to it now that it's been a little bit more literalized and the actors can actually play off of it. And I actually started to get that longing from Yaz and the trying to pull away from the Doctor. The moment where the Doctor says, you know, if it would be with anyone, it would be with you, did ring ultimately true. I wish, again, there had been some build up to it, besides it just happening, that would have made this feel a little bit better. But in the episode, it is performed rather well. And this brings me to the final moment of the episode between Yaz and the Doctor, I thought was the best moment of the episode. Again, doesn't work as powerfully as it could have had this been built up over multiple episodes over the course of several series instead of just being something that like came out of existence over the past few episodes, despite I know many shippers sort of seeing it before then. But for me, it just sort of more come out recently in terms of the show really visualizing it for me in a sense. But regardless, the scene was played rather well. I thought Jodie really brought the sense of like, I cannot be with you in this type of relationship because I need to pull away. And I feel like this scene finally, for like really the first time, and considering it's the penultimate episode of her run, it's about time, clued me into who this Doctor is and like what her arc has been over the course of the past 2 or 3 series. And I think it has been that she isolates herself and pulls herself away from people. We've gotten little hints of that too in like series 12 and 11, where she would not tell her companions about the fall of Gallifrey and everyone dying there, or her being unable to really connect with Graham when he was sort of dealing with mental health stuff in that one episode from, I believe, series 12. How just she as a character has not been able to truly connect with other people because she tries to directly isolate herself. She doesn't let people in. And her pulling away from Yaz in this moment, just wanting to exist in the present with her because nothing lasts forever, kind of verbalizes a lot of that arc that has been left understated throughout the entire series. And not particularly drawn out well, but it finally does put like a nice bow on the arc that has been this version of the Doctor. And so I'm like, at least there's something that I can pull out of her characterization over the past few years that feels like a through line, like something that was, say, David Tennant's coming into terms with being one of the more arrogant doctors, or Christopher Eccleston being a sort of doctor suffering with PTSD, trying to find new purpose and meaning in his life. Like, those are very strong arcs for those doctors, and I'm starting to get that a little bit with Jodie Whitaker's Doctor, and I thought that this final moment really rang that home, and I did appreciate it a lot. Again, would have been better with build-up, but it worked here. That all leads me to the trailer for next week's episode, which I know there's like returning companions and stuff. I don't really recognize them because, again, I don't know Classic Who much, but a lot of the like returning characters that we're seeing pop in, I was like, oh, that's really, really cool. And it was nice to see Dee also pop up within Dan's story, because I wasn't exactly a fan of where they ended. So I'm like, oh, this feels like it'll be a nice little culmination. I worry a little bit too much about it being overstuffed like Flux was, with too many things happening. But ultimately at this point, I'm just like, that's par for the course for CHIBNALL's era, so might as well go out like you've been doing this entire time and have it be a hot mess, because at the very least, a hot mess will be interesting, if nothing else, because ultimately this one was just bland. And I'd rather a hot mess than a bland episode, and ultimately I think this one's going to be just kind of forgettable in the long run of things. But that's all my thoughts for Legend of the Sea Devils. I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down below, my friends. Did you like this one a lot more than I did? I'd love to hear all of that. But beyond all of that, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you, as always, my friends, live long and prosper.